8 participants. There may be 1 or 2 still coming in, I don't know, but it's well past 7 o'clock, so let's start. My name's Andrew Thin, and I'm absolutely delighted to have so many. This is the best attended virtual public meeting we've had so far, and I'm really pleased about that. I'm chairman of the Scottish Land Commission, and I will be chairing this public meeting, or virtual public meeting. I probably know quite a few of you. I also chair Scottish Canals and a small charitable foundation, among other things. My background is in public bodies and land-related things. Before we go any further, I'm going to ask the other members of the panel to introduce themselves, and then I'll explain how the sort of format for this evening. Lauren, could I ask you to introduce yourself, please, and you'll need to unmute yourself as you go.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Mcleod. I'm one of the land commissioners. I'm based in Oban. I'm a chartered accountant, and prior to this role, I was a chairman of Community Land Scotland, which is the representative body for community landowners in Scotland. And I've been involved with land reform for about 25 years in various guises, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here this evening and look forward to the questions and discussion later. Thanks.
Lauren, thanks very much indeed. So Lauren's one of our commissioners and has done many of these public meetings. We used to do them, of course, all over the country. Sally's the other commissioner here. Sally, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here. I'm also a Scottish Land Commissioner, and I'm based up in the Outer Hebrides, so I don't get to go to so many of the public meetings when they're being held in person. So I'm actually delighted that this is virtual and I can join you tonight and hear some views from the other end of the country. I was an agricultural consultant for many years, having studied maths and some environmental biology to do with squirrels in my younger life. And I now work for a community landowner as a development manager, which involves everything to do from estate management to developing tourism projects. So it's a quite varied but enjoyable job. And in my spare time as Scottish Land Commissioner, which I thoroughly enjoy.
Thanks, Sally. You do make me feel old when you talk about your younger life, I must admit. And the other person on the panel is Shona, and Shona is a senior member of our staff. Shona, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
So, hello everybody. I'm likewise also pleased to be here and looking forward to the discussion. My name is Shona Glenn, and I head up the policy and research team in the Land Commission. My background is in economics and economic development, and I've got a particular interest in the economics of well-being and inequality.
Shona, thanks very much indeed. So, for the first 3 years or so of our existence as a Land Commission, or 4 years, we held public meetings every month all over the country, and we travelled around and we were in village halls and all sorts of places, and it was really important. It informed very early on the priorities that we worked to, because it enabled us to understand what it was that people were particularly exercised about, and so on and so forth. Of course, since COVID came along, that has ceased to be possible, and very frustrating, because the last public meeting we actually had in the Borders was in Kelso, and we should have had one in Hawick in the autumn. And I was really looking forward to that, actually, because there is significant difference, I suspect, between Kelso and Hawick. So we're now trying to do this by virtual technology, and it's actually working pretty well. I'm very pleased with it. It's not perfect, and you'll experience it for yourselves, so you can judge for yourselves. The format that we'll use, which has worked pretty well so far, is that there will be about a 10-minute presentation which Lauren will give, which is really just a scene setter. It's just to help you get a feel for the sort of breadth of what we're doing. That's all. And then we want to have a conversation with you, really, or a discussion using the panel, but we want to hear from you, and that will last up to 8:30. We'll see how it goes. I'm committed to closing by 8:30. If we dry up before then, well, fine, we'll close before then. But up until 8:30, we'll have a discussion. To do that, we'll use this, what is called the chat function. So there's a chat button. If you click on that button, you can then type in your thoughts or your questions or whatever else. But we'll come to that after the presentation. I should emphasize, I think, that I don't see this, and we don't see this, as a simple sort of question and answer discussion, although it inevitably will be that to some extent. We want your views, and we want you to hold us to account. We are public servants. We are advising the government on land reform on your behalf. So please challenge us. Don't, if you don't like what we're doing, please say so. We're not we want to hear that. So it is a genuine discussion. However, we'll come back to that in a second. I'm now going to pass to Lorne, and Lorne, you can just set the scene for us, 10 minutes or so. Over to you, Lorne.
Okay, thanks for that introduction. This is a bit of a quick run through all that we've been involved with over the last 3 years, and then moving on to the work that we're going to be undertaking in the next 3 years. So moving forward, to kick us off, what is land reform? Well, land reform is the process of change to laws, regulations and customs regarding land ownership and use. And it really is central to big public policy challenges we have today, such as climate change, productivity, inclusion, and of course, post-COVID recovery. Why does land reform matter? Well, Scotland has one of the most concentrated land ownership patterns in the world. 50% of Scotland's privately owned rural land is in the hands of just over 400 owners. That's just 0.008% of Scotland's population total. How land is owned and used and who benefits from those arrangements is important to economic and community development being undertaken in a socially just way. The Scottish Land Commission was established in 2017 following the passing of the Land Reform Act 2016. There are 5 land commissioners and 1 tenant farming commissioner, supported by a small team of core staff. Our role is to stimulate fresh thinking and change in how Scotland owns and uses land, and to advise the Scottish Government on an ongoing programme of land reform. As well as providing advice and recommendations for law and policy reform, we provide leadership for change in culture and behaviour on the ground. Much of our work is underpinned by Scotland's Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement. Now, this statement was one of the outcomes of the Land Reform Act 2016 and is the first of its kind in the world in terms of setting out the relationship between land reform and human rights, recognising that along with rights to own land come responsibilities to your neighbours, to your community, and the wider public good. Property rights used to be perceived as a barrier to land reform, but Scotland is now moving in line with the rest of the world in recognising that human rights can actually be a springboard for progressing land reform, and that land reform itself can help fulfil our human rights obligations. In showing you this slide, I'm wanting to give you a flavour of the work that we have undertaken since we were established, before talking about the work we will take forward in the next 3 years. So just going from the top of the screen there, concentration of land ownership. We published proposals in 2019 to address the impact of Scotland's highly concentrated pattern of private land ownership, including proposing a public interest test for land ownership of scale. We have now published legislative proposals on this subject in the last few weeks. Vacant and derelict land, a major focus in the past 3 years has been on vacant and derelict land. There remain 11,000 hectares of these sites across Scotland. Now that's roughly equivalent to twice the size of the city of Dundee, causing a significant blight on local communities and missed opportunities of not using that land more productively. Together with SEPA, the Environment Protection Agency, we established the Vacant and Derelict Land Task Force, which has brought national attention to the issue and published recommendations to bring back land into productive use. Land value sharing, well, we have advised the government on how the uplift value of land created by public investments, for example, improvements in infrastructure or planning permission, could be more effectively shared between private developers and society. Land for housing, we've also undertaken a wide-ranging review of how land is being made available for housing and for development projects. This started at the end of 2019, recognising that we need a fundamental change in how land is made available for housing if we want to create places that people want to live in at prices they can afford. We will report on the results of this work to ministers sometime this year. Good Practice Programme, all of our work is underpinned by the government's Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. So we've invested a lot of time to develop guidance and protocols, as well as working with different types of landowners and communities around what changes are needed in practice on the ground. We've published 8 protocols so far. We have published advice to the government on regional land use partnerships, which build on the land use strategy and the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. And 5 pilot areas have been announced this month, 1 for the south of Scotland, including the Scottish borders. Finally, and by no means least, is the work of our Tenant Farming Commissioner, whose role is to improve relationships between tenant farmers and landlords. He has published 7 codes of practice and a range of guidance, and I'll give more details in this presentation later. So now moving on to the next 3 years of our work, you'll see on the screen here in the slide, our new strategic plan and detailed programme of work are available on our website, and we have 3 priority areas: reforming land rights, responsible land ownership and use, and reforming land markets. This work on reforming land rights will contribute in particular to Scotland's ambitions for repopulating rural areas, ensuring land is more easily available for housing and infrastructure, increasing community ownership of land and buildings, community wealth building, and supporting our wider economic recovery and renewal. Within this work stream, we shall be looking at how we can have more diverse land ownership, and we shall also be identifying new governance models for owning land, possible hybrid governance models, and also managing our common good land. The second work stream is responsible land ownership and use, with the aim of making sure that whoever owns or uses land are doing it in a way which is more responsible and accountable to local communities and the public benefit. So in our new strategic plan, we shall continue to invest a lot of resources in helping landowners of all types and local communities adopt and implement the Land Rights and Responsibility Statement. We are also going to be looking at how the statement could be mainstreamed within local authorities, public agencies, and the private sector. Our work will also involve advising the government on the land use strategy and the guidance on community engagement in land use decision making. And the work of the Tenant Farming Commissioner is also, of course, focused on responsible land ownership and use, and I'm going to speak more about that later. Our third and final work stream is reforming land markets. We see land values as being critical for many of the issues that land reform aims to deal with. For example, how land is used productively and how more people can benefit from owning or using land. Now, land values have increased more than 450% since 1995. They are now valued across the whole of the United Kingdom at £5 trillion. This has led many people to question how the benefits from increasing land values are distributed, and whether more needs to be done to ensure that the gains from rising land values benefit society as a whole. Part of the answer to how we derive greater public benefits from changing land values are tax and fiscal frameworks. we have set up a tax advisory group to work with us in looking in greater depth at tax reforms in relation to land and property. We are also looking at more practical options for reforming land markets to enable land to better deliver public benefits. The final few minutes of this presentation will focus on the work of the Tenant Farming Commissioner, Bob McIntosh. The role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner was created following the 2016 Land Reform Act, and the role is to encourage and promote good relations between farming tenants and landlords. 7, or I think it's now 8, codes of practice have been issued so far on subjects such as conducting rent reviews, sporting rights, and agreeing and managing agricultural leases. Where an interested party formally reports an alleged breach of a published code of practice, the Tenant Farming Commissioner will investigate a breach and has the ultimate power to impose a penalty for failure to comply. However, it has been seen that most issues have been resolved through amicable discussion and agreement, and the Tenant Farming Commissioner has promoted mediation as a route to avoid legal proceedings. Another important role of the Tenant Farming Commissioner is to support new entrants to farming through such initiatives as the Land Matching Service and encouraging succession planning. So that's really been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through all that we've been involved with and all we intend to be involved with over the next 3 years. So thank you for listening to me, and I'll pass back to Andrew.
Lauren, thank you very much indeed. So that's a whistle-stop tour. Inevitably didn't cover everything, but hopefully it's given you a bit of a flavour. Now, I have 2 questions that were emailed in before this meeting, but actually I may come back to them in a second. Both are actually about land use issues and are not directly questions for us, though I will try and address them. I want though to go, there's a question on the chat that came in. It's an assertion and a question. It's a really important one, so I'm going to go straight to the chat. So Alexa Seagrave, thank you very much for that one. So the question, well, it's an assertion and then a question. Land not used, vacant and derelict land, is not lacking in value. That's absolutely clear. Is land left as well valued by the system? What value is placed on ecosystem services and biodiversity value of such classified land? So this is very much part of our thinking on vacant and derelict land as we did, and we've done a huge amount of work. Shona, would you like to say, not just about this specific question, but more generally, just a bit about vacant derelict land, the recommendations we gave to government and how government has responded so far?
Yeah, I'm delighted to. So I suppose that the first point to note is actually this is a really good question, and the way that we have approached all of our work, particularly the work on vacant and derelict land and the issue of land value, is that value shouldn't just be counted in pounds and pence. You know, there is so much about land value that is really, really important that isn't captured in sort of traditional approaches to cost-benefit analysis, and biodiversity is definitely one of those things. You're absolutely right to say that land, just because land is empty, it isn't necessarily lacking in value. That's absolutely true. And one of the recommendations actually that we made through the task force was that local authorities should undertake an audit of their vacant and derelict land portfolios to work out what the biodiversity potential of that land is. So yeah, great question, and yes, completely agree with the sentiment.
So Shona, can you just say a wee bit more? So the government has allocated £50 million for investment in vacant and derelict to try and start to tackle. I mean, it's a massive problem, isn't it? But they've allocated 50, and some would say that's a drop in the ocean, but at least it's a start, and it's still a lot of money. And certainly there is some thought that some of that money could be used by communities for environmental enhancement, so on. Can you say a wee bit more about that?
Yeah,
where
absolutely.
you think this might go?
So one of the main recommendations of the task force was that the government should invest in the creation of a major programme of green infrastructure investment. And we were absolutely delighted when the government responded to that request with this new £50 million fund. The details of it haven't been agreed yet. It's that new, but it's pretty clear from initial discussions that the intention is that it should be used to support much wider projects than your traditional regeneration projects, including your green infrastructure, your children's play parks, places for people to grow food, and all the kind of functional green infrastructure that's so important for communities. So it's a really exciting project, actually.
Brilliant, thanks, Shona. And let's be clear, vacant and derelict land is not just an urban phenomenon at all. I have vacant and derelict sites in the village just down the road from me. And there was actually a great piece in last week's Scotsman about work in Mary Hill to convert vacant and derelict land into green space, growing food, biodiversity, and so on. So it is already happening. That's terrific. Now, I'm going to just go down. So Anne Packard, thanks. Yes, the whole of this meeting, not just the slides, the whole meeting is being recorded. I should have said that, it was up on the first slide. The whole of this meeting is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel within a day or two. So you'll get the whole thing, not just the slides. Now, I'm going to go to, while please get typing and let's have your thoughts, but I'm going to go to the questions that were emailed in, and I'm going to ask Sally to offer some thoughts. So both questions are essentially asking about something that's not directly a Land Commission issue. So let's be clear, our job is to advise government and advise Parliament, and to an extent to advise landowners and the wider public on a range of issues to do with land rights and responsibilities. But the questions that they're both very long questions, so I'm just going to paraphrase them. One's from Michael Van Benen and one's from Kate Foster. Michael's question, essentially, it's around, we've issued a protocol, and Sally will say more about this. We've issued a protocol to guide land management decision-making. He said in the question, guide land management practices. It's actually land management decision-making. But that doesn't mean that we're about to tell people how they should use their land. And the question which then goes on, would the Land Commission support a move to make it mandatory for the licensing of the release of commercially raised game birds? And that goes well beyond the kind of our areas of work. You can see that Department of Agriculture or SNH might advise government on something like that, but not us. We have, I should say, I think Lauren mentioned, we have issued a code of practice through the tenant farming function, which is helpful in this area. The other question from Kate Foster, thanks Kate, is sort of similar in a way. Again, it makes the point that we've issued, makes the point that the land rights and responsibilities statement issued by the government talks a lot about good stewardship being at the heart of decision making, and that good stewardship in an age of climate emergency must include carbon management. So that's absolutely clear. Her question is, what steps are the Land Commission proposing to ban muir burn? And it goes on. And again, that is not our role. We are not in that sort of business. We've been set up to advise the government on land rights and responsibilities. If there is to be a ban on muir burn, that's likely, I think, to come from, the advice would probably come from SNH, I would think, in that instance. But Sally, could you say a wee bit more about the protocol referred to, and you might also want to refer to the land use partnerships and how that may help to try and address these sorts of issues?
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Well, yeah, these are very specific issues which we wouldn't necessarily advise on, but we have got 8 protocols which are all about how landowners and land use decision makers work with their communities and neighbours. And actually some of the issues in these questions are relevant to more than one of the protocols. So for example, we have a protocol on good stewardship of land, but we also have ones to do with transparency and community engagement. And I think a lot of the issues, these kind of issues that can start happening comes from a lack of engagement between landowners and communities. So there's really good advice for both sides in these protocols about how to improve those things. And more recently, the regional land use partnerships, as Lauren mentioned earlier, they've just very recently been pilots have been launched, including one that covers the south of Scotland and the Scottish borders. And these are they're not a new idea because they have been around in the past, but they're being reinvigorated. And these are very much relevant to these questions because they're really, really ambitious proposals, because they're about setting up partnerships where public authorities, communities and land sector experts work together and come together to take strategic regional decisions on things like climate change and how the regional land use can help things like economic recovery and economic renewal. So they're really, really ambitious strategic decisions, but they could also take decisions on things like Muirdown on a regional scale. It would be up to each pilot to kind of decide on those kind of issues if they were relevant to them and if they had that within their powers. They're very much at a early stage in their development at the moment. We've provided some advice to government, and then government are running these pilots to see how they can work. But I think they're quite exciting because they do tackle these big issues, but you can also see on a practical local level, they could be used for things like flood management. So I think they're a really exciting thing to look to the future.
Sally, thanks. I wonder if, Jess, if you could put up on a link to the advice we gave to government on local on land use partnerships. If you haven't already done so, I can't see it. We gave advice to government quite recently on this, and as Sally says, the government has announced there will be pilots, and one will be in the borders. So you will become much more involved in that. And we have, you'll see our advice, but we have made it very clear. We think these partnerships need to have teeth. Precisely how those teeth will work is why we need the pilots. But we have said that we think they need to have teeth. Now I'm going to move on. Sorry, I'm actually going to come back to you with this next question, Sally. So I hear no mention of crofting. This is from John Campbell. I hear no mention of crofting. Are there any plans to reform crofting? Now, just to be clear, we have a crofting commission in Scotland, and their job is to advise government on crofting. This is the problem. I think some people would like us to take over the world, which is very flattering, but government has a range of sources of advice from different sorts of places. We, as a board, have met a couple of times with the board of the Crofting Commission to discuss all sorts of crofting issues, but it is their job to give the advice. But there are some plans for reform. There was talk of the possibility of a radical overhaul, but that seems to have not gone down terribly well. Sally, can you just give us a brief, insofar as you know, where things have got to with crofting reform?
Well, my understanding is that it hasn't happened. It hasn't obviously happened yet, but that it may be looked at in the next parliamentary session. And obviously we don't know what's going to happen there. But there has been some pretty radical discussion to look at whether we, and there was some consultations out about this, and there was actually visits right around Scotland to talk to crofters about this, to decide whether we scrap all the current crofting legislation and start from scratch, or whether we do some tweaks. And as far as I know, that's still being grappled with. So we don't kind of know what's coming next, but there are some really kind of pretty big conversations happening about that. It was pretty ambitious, some of the stuff they were talking about. Quite scary as well to imagine scrapping all the legislation and starting from scratch. So I don't know the time frame for that or where they've got to with that, but I know that's what was being discussed. I would say probably 2019. So it may be COVID that's had a bit of an influence on slowing down the discussions.
Okay, thanks, Sally. So important that John, if you contact the Crofting Commission to get an up-to-date position on that. Now, there's a lot of comments and thoughts coming in, so I'm going to move reasonably speedily on. So Andrew Braff, thank you. What's the Land Commission doing to assist in the relaxation of planning laws to allow people to build houses on small areas of land? Now, again, let's just be careful. You know, our job is land reform, not planning. There's obviously tempting to ask us to get involved in all sorts of things, but Shona, we have done a lot of thinking about planning, not necessarily specific to this question, but you want just to give a quick sort of sketch of the work we have done in relation to planning and planning gain and so on.
Yeah, so we've certainly done quite a lot of work on this, Andrew, and that's certainly true. What I would say, I think, is, I mean, first of all, it's a good question. But what I would say, and this goes for an awful lot of questions that you get about the housing and land market, it isn't just about planning restrictions, just as it isn't just about land. There are a whole load of moving parts within the planning system, within the housing development system, and I think the overarching message from a lot of the work we have done is that actually tweaking one part of the system isn't going to fix the problem. It needs to be a system-wide change. So I think that's the first thing I would say. When you're talking specifically about access to land for housing in rural areas, planning rules, I think, certainly are part of the issue. But actually the bigger issue, I think, and this did emerge strongly from work we did last year, which looked specifically at access for land and housing in rural areas. The really big issue is actually more about viability of development in rural areas. There are extra costs associated with building in rural areas, which often mean that building in rural areas just simply isn't attractive to commercial developers. That's the biggest part of the problem. The final thing to add is we did do some work, as I mentioned, looking specifically at the issue of access to land in rural areas for housing. We published that last year, and that was part of the wider review that we're doing on land for housing and development, which we're going to be publishing next month. And that will include recommendations about rural planning policies, and specifically the need for more sympathetic policies which are tailored to rural areas and not just sort of tailored for more urban Scotland.
Great, thanks, Shona. So Andrew Ruff, please look out for that report next month. It should give you a lot more on this, but please also recognise that planning is a wider issue than just the land reform dimension. A question from Simon on farming tenancies. Many landowners appear to be ending tenancies of farming land themselves. Is this an unintended consequence of land reform? Well, I think it's debatable. I mean, landowners are taking land in hand for all sorts of reasons, and there certainly may be some who take the view that they'd rather farm it in hand than tenant it under modern agricultural tenure legislation. And that's a decision for them. It doesn't, in a sense, from an economic point of view, as long as farms are run well and productively and all the rest of it, who does that is not so crucial. I think it's actually highly questionable whether many of the decisions to take land in hand are necessarily a consequence of land reform per se. It is, for example, and Lauren might want to say more about this, it's more tax efficient on the whole to manage land in hand than it is to lease it. And we're doing some work on tax. Do you want just to give us a quick, I know it's very early days, Lauren, but a quick outline of the tax work, please?
Okay, thanks for that. We actually undertook about a year ago a scoping report just to look at all the tax and fiscal levers that could possibly be used in relation to land and property. And that is indeed available on our website, and maybe one of my colleagues will be able to put up a link to that as an ALMA economics report that was undertaken. But on the back of that, we've set up a tax advisory group, which has met a couple of times and has got future meetings ahead of it. The first couple of meetings were concentrating on policy initiatives that are linked to tax that is within the Scottish competency. So we're looking at things like land and building transaction tax, and we're also looking at non-domestic rates, and perhaps particularly we're looking at things like vacant and derelict land and how to prevent more shops in town centres, for instance, becoming derelict post-COVID. So any incentives that might be made to encourage town centre regeneration, and also looking at concentrated land ownership and perhaps tax in that regard as well. Our future meetings going forward are looking at also tax matters that are reserved to Westminster. We will be culminating in making recommendations, I think, at the end of the summer coming into the autumn there. But within that, we'll be looking at just a wide plethora of our policy objectives as a land commission, and how we might be able to use tax and fiscal powers to contribute towards achieving some of those objectives. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. And Simon, thanks for the question. I'd be more than happy if you want to email in and we can set up a phone call on the sort of wider points about around that. It is a very difficult one for government. At the end of the day, agricultural tenure legislation balances the rights of landowners and the rights of tenants, and it is a very difficult balance. If landowners have too many rights in comparison to tenants, then society will not be comfortable with that. If tenants have too many rights in relation to landowners, there is a risk that landowners will refuse to let land, and that's not necessarily helpful either. So it's a very difficult balance for government to get right, very difficult indeed. And at the end of the day, society through Parliament has to decide, where it wants that balance to sit. But more than happy to have a brother on the phone about that. The next thing is from B. Harvey. I'm sorry, I don't know what B stands for, Bill or Bob, but I can't read it. It's a Word file, I think. So if you could just type into the chat box your observation, then that would be super. And again, I think the next one's from Anne. I think it'll be Anne Packard. She says, I have a question about regional land use partnerships. Could you just type your question in and we'll try and deal with that, please? We've also put the link up to the advice now. Now, the next question from Margaret Elliott is hugely important in the Borders and indeed in Dumfries and Galloway, which is the driver in public policy to plant more woodland to help capture carbon and so on, but which inevitably has significant social consequences and economic consequences. I walked through parts of the Borders not very long ago, before, well, must be a year ago because it was before COVID, and you can see sheep farms being ploughed up before your eyes. It's extraordinary. So how do we find a balance there? And I do think that is primarily a land use partnership is the way forward there. But I'm going to turn to Sally just to offer some thoughts about, so how at a regional level might one sensibly find that kind of balance? How do we think that might happen? You've got some thoughts, or use an example from your own experience in the Western Isles, because you plenty of land use conflicts in the Western Isles too.
Well, it's interesting actually, and I don't have the answers. I wish I did. If I had the answer to that, I think we would all be able to just stop and go home right now. So it's a very difficult question. I think the key here, and I think it's important with the regional land use partnerships, is that the question may be different in different areas. So we have land use conflicts where I am, and one of the problems we have is that so we have quite a lot of community land ownership, but it doesn't follow the estate boundaries don't follow the community boundaries. So we have places where communities are split in two. So you can end up with kind of decisions being really hard to take because you've got a boundary down the middle and different landowners and then different communities and in private ownership next to community ownership. But actually, we found working together is really beneficial, and we do have we've just actually constituted a group of community landowners that work together. So we're able to take some of our decisions on a more regional type level and work together on things. And one of the things we're actually looking at is forestry and how where it's suitable in our location, and then housing. And another thing we talk about a lot is housing and working together with the different organisations that can help us with housing. So I think it's a kind of first step, or a kind of first step towards a regional land use partnership that's just come about as a result of these kind of unusual boundaries we have. And so I hope that regional land use partnerships will help in other places to allow conversations to happen at a higher level on things like forestry and housing, and where it's suitable and where it's not, and where it's too much. But I don't have the answer to the question, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Alex. Margaret, thanks for this question. I do think this is, I mean, no one's going to pretend it's an easy one, but so let's be clear. First of all, it's highly unlikely that Sitka spruce will be planted without government grant. So government essentially controls what happens here, and government is subject to democratic decision-making processes. So this is not something that's out with people's control. And if we can make a system, let's call it regional land use partnerships, because that's what's being proposed and that's what's going to be piloted in the board. If we can create a system that genuinely works, where people can collaborate and come up with a solution that at least suits the majority of people in that community or that area, then we do have the levers. It's not out with control. So I think I'm probably more optimistic. I mean, when I walked through the borders and saw the scale of planting that was going on, I was a bit shocked and possibly slightly pessimistic. But the more I think about it, the more I'm becoming more optimistic. So please, get involved in this pilot. It's hugely important. And on the same tone, one from Pip Tabor, thanks Pip. So I can't remember whether we actually recommended. Zali's shaking her head. So probably should quickly have passed this.
Well, I can't remember either. So no, I've had a quick scan of the document and I don't think we've recommended a number on the board as such.
But the second part of that question, though, maybe you could offer some thoughts. So I'm not sure how many seats. Please read. We put a link up to the document. If you can't find the link, don't worry. Email us and we'll get it to you. But the second part of that question is important. A pragmatic point, which is what sort of detail do you see the land use partnerships getting into? I mean, is it going to go sort of field by field through what people are planting, or is it more broad than that? Why don't you have a shot? And I don't know whether Shona or Lauren might want to add something, but you start, Sally.
Yeah, I think Shona might have actually some information to add. So we haven't said how many in a seat, but they are very big areas, and we have given recommendations of that it has community representation, land sector representation, and kind of public body government representation on those boards. And we have also talked about things like the requirement for staff to ensure they keep going with momentum and so on and so forth. And in terms of level of detail, again, this is what the pilots are for, to sort of answer some of these questions. But I certainly don't see them getting into saying, this is going to be potatoes and this is going to be wheat. I mean, it's not about that. And it's not about telling farmers, communities or landowners what they can or cannot do. It's about looking at the landscape on a regional level and taking those kind of sensitive, balanced questions on things like green space, peatland restoration, flood management. So it's about those kind of landscape things where you have to just take a step back and look wider than individual landowners or individual farms and say, how does this all work together?
Thanks, Ali. But clearly a big strategic question for the borders is how much how much land do we want to plant to trees, how fast, what kind of trees. Those are big strategic questions that you would expect a land use partnership to grapple with. Yeah
absolutely. And I think for example, in the Outer Hebrides, the question, we might not grapple with that question because we're putting in much smaller pockets of trees, but we might be grappling with peatland restoration and how it works, because you can have people, one dead keen and one not so keen, but you actually both have to be in to make it work. And we can be looking at how we manage to do it most effectively for everyone and for tackling climate change. I think, Shona, you might have something to add on this.
Want to add to that, Shona?
I don't think I could add to anything you've just said, Sally. I think you've anything I would have said, you've taken the words right out of my mouth. So, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Pip, thanks for that question. And please, both I say this to both you and Margaret, get stuck into this pilot. Please try and get involved. It's going to need people to get in there and figure out how it's going to work. But I think the clue's in the name. It's a pilot. So let's try and figure it out. The next question from Alex Bailey, are you going to be developing the regional land use maps? Now, I think that was SNH that was advising on that. It's not a land reform issue. I'm just going to check with Shona. That's right, isn't it, Shona? Yes, I'm right. So you need to ask that question to SNH. I'm sorry, it's not one for us, Alex, though it clearly, well, it feels like a really sensible question to me. Anne, this is the question you referred to above. So how will there be equity between different discipline sectors on the boards? And equally, will there be a balance or split between Dumfries and Galloway and Scottish Borders Council within the proposed IRE? So Sally, to what extent, interesting word, equity. What can you recall what we said on this?
I don't know it off the top of my head. I will look back now. Perhaps Shona knows the detail on this one.
I don't, Sally, but I suspect that that's because the detail wasn't in the report. I could be wrong, but I think that's probably the case. Yeah, so no,
I mean, I think, Anne, in part, at any rate, there's no question in my mind that the answer to your question is that that's what the pilot's for, is to figure this sort of stuff out. And that, if we knew all the answers, we wouldn't need pilots. So I think that's part of the answer, and particularly the last part of your question about the split. I mean, that's got to be worked out sensibly as part of setting the pilot up, and I'm afraid I simply don't know. And we're not leading these pilots, government's leading the pilots. So I'm really sorry. It sounds as if I'm saying that's not ours, but we cannot. We're a tiny organisation with a tiny team, and we've given advice on this, and it will now go forward. Right, Crick, Carlton, thank you. Sorry, it's quite a long question. I haven't managed to read it. I think it's an observation. Yes, thank you. So that's an observation, and it's very helpful actually. And I know we are in touch with South of Scotland Enterprise. Our staff talk to them quite a lot, and to local authorities, so that's great. My questions, Anne replied. I'm not sure what I understand. Yeah, and I don't think we can answer your question now, because I don't think that's been decided. If the question is, will there be equity? I mean, I don't know what equity means, but there will have to be some way of getting a sensible balance, and clearly, likewise, local authorities. I don't think we can answer it. We're not running this pilot, so I don't think we can. You need to talk to Scottish Government. Alexa, back to Alexa again. Thanks again for this. Types of forestry is important too. Yes, absolutely. I tried to make that point in what I said, that it is clearly a big strategic issue for borders. Whether there is an increase in forestry, where it is, and what kind of forestry, and timescales and everything else. So all of that, absolutely. I think what you say there is absolutely true. It's not. I don't think we need to say any more. It's absolutely right. Sally Thomas, why did the Land Commission recommend further pilots when there have already been 2 very successful land use pilots which generated a huge amount of information and learning? Well, I think it's to build on that. It's not to replace the work that's already been done, but there does seem to be a debate about just exactly how whether the pilots that have already been run do create a blueprint. And I think the conclusion was that they don't, and we still, there's still some way to go. We were certainly very clear that there needed to be real teeth here. So I think that's important. But if you think that, if you think that's wrong, then so be it. Tell Scottish Government you don't want a pilot. But I think that's I'm not sure we can add to that really. We were asked to provide advice, and we did. Let's go on to Yap's question about tax. Lauren, can you see this question?
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Yap. There. One of the things, basically Yap's question, everyone can see it there. He was talking about tax in relation to concentrated land ownership. Would we be correct to assume that this taxation would apply to all landowners? Well, I think in response to that, we'd have to say it's still early days. As I said earlier, we're hoping to make recommendations at the end of the summer, maybe into autumn there. One of the important things when you're looking at anything to do with tax is unintended consequences. So it's very important that everything is carefully considered. We undertake detailed modelling. We also have to look at the principles that should underpin any tax reforms. And indeed, you've highlighted there fairness and equity. These are key principles to look at. But we're still at very early days, and we're looking at a wide set of objectives quite across the piece in terms of Scottish Land Commission. So really it's too early to actually conclude or make any recommendations so far. we have the benefit of a tax advisory group. I think it's 9 or 10 individuals there who have a range of backgrounds. We've got an expert on land and property from Turk and Connell. We've got the Director of Taxation from the Institute of Chartered Accountants. And we've also got an expert on economic background in relation to tax. So we've got a wide plethora of ideas and inputs here. But as I say, we're taking things carefully, we're undertaking the modelling, and we are also very conscious of unintended consequences when you change one tax, that it has implications elsewhere. So this is I would say, a more of a long-term review. Thank you.
Lauren, thanks. There's a point in there, though, that I maybe come to Shona very quickly, Shona, because I've now got loads of things that I need to get through. But making the point that many big landowners are public organisations or local authorities and probably aren't paying tax at all. Shona, you addressed that in the scale and concentration report we published 10 days ago. Could you just briefly refer to that? Because it's a crucial point. Some of Scotland's biggest landowners are, in fact, public bodies.
Yes, there are a couple of points actually, Andrew, that I would add to what Lauren said, although what I agree with everything Lauren has said. The first point is that for me, the issue here isn't really about the legal structure of the owner that we're talking about. It's more about how accountable that owner is to the public. And the second issue, I think, is you're absolutely right. We shouldn't be letting public landowners or charities or anybody else off the hook just because they happen to have a particular legal structure. And we have been very clear. Andrew mentioned the work that we've done on scale and concentration. The original research that we did on scale and concentration of land ownership was very clear that the issue here was not just about private landowners. It was about concentration of power. And that can exist regardless of the legal structure of the land in question. Does that answer your question, Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. I'm very keen that you just picked up Jaap's point about that. Not all landowners pay tax, and Jaap has, in the question, hasn't referred to charities, but I do just emphasise that point. Shona, you've made the point, but we absolutely we are very focused on the fact that there are big landowners that are public bodies and big landowners who are charities. And so tax is not the only tool here. And I may come back to you, Shona, about the scale and concentration recommendations, but I'm going to try and move through this. So there's a comment about Sitka. That's a very helpful comment. Thanks for that. And the next question is about urban blight and absentee owners, and have we any thoughts on compulsory purchase? Could you just very briefly, Shona, explain the advice we've given to government on compulsory sale orders, please?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on compulsory purchase and compulsory sales. The compulsory sale order that Andrew mentions here is most relevant here. And we made recommendations to government a couple of years ago now for this new power, which would give local authorities the ability to require landowners who had been sitting on land or buildings, small plots, blighted plots, owners who've been sitting on plots like that for an extended period of time in the hope that the value will go up. And we are proposing that local authorities would have the power to compel those landowners to bring those sites up for sale at public auction to the highest bidder. So I think that's going to be a really, really important tool in the toolbox for urban regeneration. Really important point.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm moving through these quite fast because there's so many people coming in with comments, but that's fine. So who's going to take responsibility for litter? That's really, I'm sorry, but with the best will in the world, we cannot get involved in litter. That's local authorities. Or I think I might argue it's the person who put it there. Point taken about citrus spruce, absolutely. And the Forestry Commission, or Forestry Land Scotland, absolutely holds the levers, and therefore, regional land use partnerships can influence what the mix looks like, and I hope they will. Anne, ask your last three. I don't know what that is. Sorry, I'm very sorry, Anne. I just don't know what that is. I think these very detailed questions you might be better to put in an email, and we'll try and get someone to respond to you. Unless Sally knows. Do you know what that is, Sally?
I think that's the next land use strategy, which there's just been a consultation on, and there's due to be further consultation on. And my understanding, or my assumption, is that it has been held up due to COVID. Shona may be able to answer or help with that, but I assume that's what it is.
Okay, but we're not. I mean, that's not.
No, it's not Scottish Government. It has just been consulted on, and my understanding is there's going to be more consultation.
So, and that's not Land Commission. That's Scottish Government. So I'm going to pass on. Well, I'm sorry, Stuart, if you think that I don't understand or we don't understand issues of afforestation. We're not a forestry expert body. That's what Forest and Land Scotland is for. What we have been asked to do and have done is given advice on how regional land use partnerships might operate, who will then deal with that. Pip, thanks. Yes, point taken about sick. Christopher Liu, or Lewis it may be, would you please say more about land value sharing? So Shona, I think I'm going to come to you first on this one. You say a bit about the work we did on this and the advice that we gave to government, please.
Mindful of the need to answer quickly, so I'm going to try and do this really quickly. The whole concept of land value sharing came about because the government asked us to look at something called land value capture. And the idea of land value capture is that when the value of a piece of land goes up because it's developed or infrastructure is put on it, and all of that value is captured by the landowner. And various things have been tried in the past for to enable the public sector to capture some of that value. And essentially what we're saying is actually that's not a very good way to be looking at it, because all it does is encourage competition between the public and private sector, which isn't a very sensible way, and it doesn't work. And actually it would be more sensible if instead of competing with each other, we actually work together to create more land value and share that equally. So what I would suggest is if you are interested in that issue, we did publish advice to government on this back in 2018, which goes into all of the detail in quite some detail. So we can post a link in the chat function, and that would be where I'd point you to, if you're keen to find out more on that.
Great, thank you. And Christopher, I mean, there's masses of details on the website about this. So, and if for some reason you can't pick the link up from the chat function, just email us and we'll get it to you. What public body is ultimately responsible for bringing everything together? That's the Scottish Government. I mean, all public bodies report to the Scottish Government, and so they should. I mean, that's how democratic accountability works. I'm going to trundle down. Will the new pilot involve the council and the Tweed Forum? I'm sure it will. Yeah, certainly the council. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with it was a long time since I had anything to do with the Tweed Forum, but certainly, absolutely. I mean, local authorities will be central to, yes. Oh, Pip makes that point. Yes, thank you, Pip. One from Amy. So this is an interesting question about community owners and how they work with private owners. Lauren, can you see that question from Amy? And if so, could you, Lauren has a lot of experience. I may ask you too, Sally, but Lauren in particular, a lot of experience of this. Lauren, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, well, thanks to Amy for putting up that question. I think I should also note that Amy Hesp is the development manager for Community Land Scotland for the south of Scotland. So it might be useful, Amy, if you also put up your contact details, because there may be representatives of community groups, say, in the audience here tonight that might be wanting to talk about any potential initiatives. But I agree obviously with the comment that you make there, and I think it's useful to see the growing interest in community land ownership in the borders. Newcastleton obviously is a successful community buyout that has been taking place there in purchasing land from Mcleod estates, and they've got very exciting plans and proposals. And again, I think I would just want to also reiterate that community land ownership is not all about buying big and large estates. It's often also about buying land on the periphery of villages or towns, as in the Newcastleton instance. And I think it serves as a good example to other communities in the borders who would like to take forward a community land purchase. Pass over to Sally if she wants to see more there.
I think it's a really good comment from Amy, and there are lots of forums where community landowners and private landowners come together. for example, things like deer management groups or salmon fisheries boards. These are kind of groups I sit on where they come together, but really it's about building relationships. And I think Amy's comment is very relevant. And I think the most important thing to remember is, regardless of the type of landowner, they all have the same rights and the same responsibilities, and they all need to be transparent and have good community engagement and work well with their communities.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to keep moving because there's a lot of questions here. Another one from Anne. I'm not sure quite what I understand what this question is. It says, what relationship does SLC envisage, and have you discussed it with Barbara? I mean, I don't think, if that relates to land use partnerships, we've given our advice on land use partnerships. Government is now dealing with land use partnerships. So we will not be involved in the land use partnership, I don't expect. More on trees, yes, that's fine. I mean, I knew this was a contentious issue, and that's why, I think that is why there's a feeling that having a pilot in the borders makes sense, because clearly there are serious issues to be addressed. Land use strategy 3 is due out in March. Will it come then? I don't know. I mean, again, these are not matters for the Land Commission, so and you need to talk to the Scottish Government about that. More on trees. Is there a formal reply to the Land Commission from government on our recommendations? Sally, I presume that's our recommendations on land use partnerships being referred to. Sally, did government, I don't think government, it doesn't normally respond to these things, do they?
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
No, I mean, our job is to give advice to government. Government then decides what it wants to do. I wouldn't expect to get a reply normally, other than, thank you, but Scottish Forestry. Yes, that's right. Thanks, Robin. Yeah, that's the point I made earlier, that the whole issue about, what is planted where, when, how, and so on and so forth, it effectively comes under the control of Forestry and Land Scotland, because they control the grant system. So and therefore, they will have to be part of and respond to the aspirations of the land use partnership. Do we know who will appoint the members of the RUP board? Well, I think it'll ultimately be Scottish Government. Sally, do you know what the position is there?
We don't know, but we've made recommendations, so that is included in our recommendations on that process, because I think it's slightly different for the different representatives. So there'll be some by open processes and different methods, but that's only our recommendations. So it'll be up to the Scottish Government to decide how that's done. So
Sally, Sally Thomas, this is. Please talk to Scottish Government. We just to be clear, because I'd like to move on to talk about other things. On the land use partnerships, we were asked to give advice, and we have given advice, and that advice has been published, and it's available to everybody to read, so please read it. We no longer are involved in land use partnerships. Scottish Government is leading on that. So we're not able to answer a lot of your questions because we're not in charge of that. Shona, thanks. There's the link on land value capture. It's a really important land value sharing, that land value capture. It's a really important piece of work that Shona did. Oh, here's a link that Sarah's found on Scottish Government website, I think. So that's great. Anne's saying it's not very informative. Oh well. There's Amy's contact details. Thanks, Amy. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know what that's about. Robin, sorry, correcting me. You're quite right, Robin. Sorry, I get muddled with terminology. It's Scottish Forestry. Yeah. Okay. Right. I've managed to catch up at last. So please, further thoughts, particularly about other areas of land reform. We've got a bit bogged down with land use partnerships. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask Shona to say, oh, well, here's a really helpful question. Graham, thank you. So the right to buy legislation, the community right to buy legislation, needs a successful ballot, and that's a high bar. I'm not aware of any chance to change the legislation, but Lorne, I think it'd be helpful if you could just offer some general thoughts about that, and more generally just about because there's more than one community right to buy, and how that's working and where you see that going.
Yep, thank you for that, and thanks to Graham there. The community right to buy to further sustainable development is a new community right to buy that the actual practicalities of that have just been rolled out at the end of last year. But that allows a community to come forward and basically put forward a proposal to say that we would like to purchase some land and put up, if they're able to put up a strong case to show that they would be able to further sustainable development on a better basis perhaps than the existing landowner, then that is a automatic right to buy, and the government minister would make the judgment on that. But to my knowledge at this stage, there haven't been any cases that have been formally considered under that legislation. There's also a community right to buy for abandoned, neglected land. And that really is a right to buy where land has been, in essence, contaminated or not been well looked after. There are various criteria within the legislation there. I think there have been 3 cases put forward under that community right to buy legislation, but I don't think any have been successful. So there's obviously a very high bar, a high threshold to overcome in terms of putting forward a very strong proposal if a community would wish to go on that basis. I think what I would say, in generality though, is that in many of the community buyouts are actually done by mutual discussion and negotiation without using legislation. And I think I can also highlight at this stage, I think something that is very important is that Scottish Land and Estates, the representative body for many of the private landowners in Scotland, and Community Land Scotland, published a protocol. And the protocol, which is signed up by both bodies, is basically if a community wishes to come forward and has an aspiration for a proposal to purchase land, then there is a step-by-step approach. And I think it's certainly on the Community Land Scotland website. It may also be on the Scottish Land and Estates website. And as I say, both organisations have signed up to that. At the end of the day, a private landowner obviously may say, no, I'm not wishing to sell this particular piece of land, but there is a step-by-step approach which can be followed, which gives a community at least the opportunity to bring forward their proposals and consult and discuss with a private landowner on that basis. So it's not all about community right to buy. And then finally, before I stop, I'll just highlight, there's also under the Community Empowerment Act of 2015, the ability for asset transfer from a public owned landowner. And many people will know about the ability for community asset transfer. And indeed, through forestry, there's many community groups that have approached the bodies. And again, I'm a bit like you, Andrew. I never remember the exact names of the bodies, but that administer forestry on the public behalf. Communities can approach them for a community asset transfer. But I'll maybe just stop there, probably gone on too long.
Thanks, Lauren. That's great. So no question, community ownership can be an extremely powerful tool. It's not the answer for everything by any means at all. We've published a great deal of work on that, and maybe Jess, you could put the link up, but if not, it's on the website. So there's a huge amount of advice that we've published on that already, and it's available on our website. And to just echo Lauren, we were very clear that if you're going to use right to buy legislation, there needs to be a high bar, because property rights matter. Our economy in many ways is based on the principle of property rights. So it's quite a challenging one, that. Crick, your question about protocols, really important area of work. And I'm going to turn to Sally. I think, can I add to the question that's there, Sally? Could you just I think it'd be helpful for everyone just to say, well, why on earth, given that our job is to advise government, why did we decide to go down the road of protocols? And you might want to link that to Bob's work.
Well, the protocols that we have, so there's 8 protocols, and they're very much about embedding the land rights and responsibility statement and trying to turn them into practical advice that can be used on the ground. And they are very much a mirror of Bob's work. So he has codes of practice because he has certain powers as the Tenant Farming Commissioner, and we have protocols, and it's all about trying to see if we can see a culture change and we can deal with some issues on the ground and also try and embed that land rights and responsibility statement in lots of areas of land ownership and land use and land management. In terms of your question, it's a really good question, and we've seen quite a good response. The protocols come out over a period of time, and we have a kind of quarterly report on kind of casework and people that have been in touch, and it's building every quarter. It's really building, and the work is building, and our staff team are doing a fantastic job to help share the information through all sorts of different streams like webinars and working one-to-one with particular communities or landowners. And my reflection on it, and this is only my kind of personal opinion, is the community engagement and the transparency, we're really seeing a lot of interaction with them because they've been around a wee while. So they take a wee while to bed in, and we're just kind of going through a journey. So they take a wee while to bed in and people to find out about and know about them. And then they're building all the time. And another thing to bear in mind is it's not just the protocols. So if there's a particular area, there's lots of other tools and guidance on our website that can help you as well. So for example, we have kind of a route map for community engagement for communities, landowners, land managers to help them. So don't feel it's just a protocol and then that's it, it stops. And we've got a good practice team that can answer individual questions and queries as well. So yeah, we've had a really good response. We've had it's been great to see kind of member organisations like Scottish Land and Estates support it as well and help us push it out to their members as well. So it's been really good.
Great, thanks, Sally. Great, thanks for the question. Early days, no question of early days. But what we do know from the Tenant Farming Commissioner experiences, that codes of practice have hugely influenced the way in which people behave in that sector. So it's reasonable, I think, to believe that protocols will influence behaviours. And it's also possibly reasonable to think that we might want to evolve from protocol to a parallel set of codes of practice, or even integrate the two. But that's looking forward. That's not for now. Debbie, common good land, hugely important area of work. We've published some stuff. I'm going to turn to Shona. Again, you're going to have to be brief, Shona, because I've only got 15 minutes left and there's still things coming through. But a quick outline of common good, and we'll see if we can get a link up for you.
Probably not an awful lot I can say actually on Andrew on common good, because we haven't done an awful lot of work on it. We did publish some work on it 2 years ago, I think, and I think my only real comment on that is there's a lot more potential there, and we would like to see more modernisation. We think we could be making much more use of our common good than we are, but modernisation, simplification probably necessary. But I think at this stage probably watch this space because we've really not worked it out yet, I think is the honest answer.
Okay, can I come in there, Andrew, as well, just to say something further on that? It's just really to make a pitch, as it were, that we've got a webinar next week on Tuesday, the 23rd of February at 11 AM on common good land and the protocol surrounding that. So Debbie, thanks very much for the question there, and there'll be a lot more information in the webinar next Tuesday. Thank you.
No, thank you. Your brain and memory are aging better than mine. I'd completely forgotten about that. That's great. Thanks for reminding us. So Debbie, please, and anybody else, please take part in that. There's a lot of interest in common good land. We found in many public meetings that it's a subject that people want to talk about. Just while we're on that, Anne Packer's asking, does it include glebe land? I don't think it does, but Shona, do you know?
I don't believe so, but it's not something we've looked at directly, but no, I don't believe so.
Okay, thanks, Shona. So Tom Trotter, thanks. this is another really important point, and if you forgive me, I'm just going to treat it as an observation. It is hugely important that Scotland does not try and reinvent wheels, but that we look around the world and see what other people are doing and see what has worked and what has not worked. And we did that right from the beginning with land value tax, when we did a very important piece of work to look at how land value tax has worked where countries have tried it. And as a matter of principle, we look for international comparisons in relation to all our work. And we try and bring back what we can in the way of learning from that. I mean, of course, Scotland's not necessarily the same as other countries, so you have to be very careful. But what you can see, you know, for example, on community ownership, much more sophisticated, complex governance models in other countries, and a range of other. You'll see if you. Shona, are there any particular bits of work that you want to flag that we could maybe just put a link up to? Because there's a number of reports that make this point particularly well.
Yeah, there's a couple, Andrew. I suppose first of all, there would be the work that we did looking at how particularly the Netherlands and Germany approach assembling land for housing and development, because those two countries seem to do it particularly well. So there's a fairly short report actually on our website that looks at that. The other bit of work I would point you towards would be the work that we did specifically on international approaches to community, communal and municipal land ownership. I think it was a really snappy title like that. And it was quite fascinating because I think the overarching message I took from that was that actually community, what we know as community ownership in this country, actually there are so many wider models around the world. You know, other countries sort of take a lot of this for granted. You know, we're quite different in that we seem to look at community land ownership as something different or special, whereas in other parts of the world it's actually just something normal. So we can post links to that in the chat, I think.
Thanks. So we'll try and get links up, but the whole website is just a treasure trove of stuff. Sally Thomas, the balance between urban and rural. Well, I mean, I hope you've seen that you know, we are. I'm not sure I want to put numbers on it, but broadly speaking, urban and rural are of equal importance. I don't think you know, a lot of our work straddles both. I think probably best to refer you to the strategic plan, which has been published for the next 3 years, and the work program for the next year. They're both published and on the website. Maybe someone could put a link up, and that will give you a feel for what we're hoping to do over the next wee while. So there's the protocol for negotiated sales, the land rights and responsibilities protocols more generally, the community engagement route map. There's the link for common good, thanks for that, and the webinar. Pip, let me see, there's nothing wrong with harping on about things. They're obviously bothering you, so that's fine. Yeah, okay. So no, SLS, the Scottish Land Commission is not involved in telling the Forestry Commission or Forest and Land Scotland or whoever how they should go about their business. You need to have a conversation with them about that. There's a link to the housing land one. Rewilding. So rewilding is an issue. So this is from Francine Hardwick. Thanks, Francine. It is an issue, and actually it's a very topical issue this week. And I mean, I'll say a bit, and then I might ask Lauren perhaps to say something. But I've been slightly dismayed, I think, that there hasn't been a more critical analysis in the media coverage so far on this. It is, you know, rewilding is no different from any other. You know, the power, if you like, to rewild land is no different from any other power that a landowner enjoys. And you know, it is, you know, we're clear that in exercising power of whatever kind, a landowner needs to take into account and accommodate and compromise around the interests and priorities of everybody else in society. It's not, they don't exist in isolation. And rewilding is no different. Rewilding is another land use. And I don't think we should make the mistake of putting rewilding on some sort of moral high ground. That would be a mistake. Lauren, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't think I would add too much to that. Just maybe an observation that rewilding as a concept, there seem to be various interpretations of that. And I think just also to stress the importance of anybody coming forward with proposals for rewilding, it's important to take the community with them. I know there's a proposal at the moment from the new owner of Bunloit Estate, which is near Drumnadrochit, I think it's a Jeremy Leggett, who is looking to rewilding of that estate and is doing some excellent work in terms of community engagement and bringing the wider community forward very much with them in taking forward development proposals for the Bunloit estate. So that's an interesting one, and there is a website that is live on Bunloit estate, can be often quite useful for people to see just the actual proposals that are coming forward and the extent of the community engagement that is being undertaken. Thanks.
Andrew.
Sorry, I was muted. Apologies. Francine's come back with a comment: in a climate emergency, rewilding must be a priority, and that may well be correct. I'm not going to comment on that. The point: it is not for the Land Commission to determine how land should be used. We are concerned with the exercise of land rights and responsibilities. And the point we're making, I hope is clear, is that the same principles apply to using land for rewilding as apply to using land for anything else. You need to, in exercising the power, the decision-making power over land use, you need to take the interests of other people with you. You need to consult. You need to collaborate, and there's that's the point we're making. Rather than, we're certainly not saying rewilding is either good or bad. More about, sorry, the Francine again. Borderlands used to be covered in trees and wildlife. Yes, rights and responsibilities do. That's the point I've just been trying to make. It's you know, no landowner has the right to just plow on and do whatever they like, whatever that thing is. They have responsibilities that go with it. Shona, do you want to add a few words on this? And then I'm going to wind down, because I said we'd close at 12:30.
Thanks, Andrew. Just a very quick point that I think often when we're talking about rewilding, everybody naturally assumes we're talking about rural Scotland. Why? There are vast areas of unused derelict land in urban Scotland, and if we were to rewild some of that, actually the benefits to the population would even be even bigger, because there's much more people live close to that land. So just a point.
Shona, thank you. And a really helpful point, actually. It's a really very good point. But the same principles apply, of course, that land use decision making needs to be a process of taking the interests of everyone into account and looking for compromises and collaborations and all the rest of it. And it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about a grouse moor or rewilding an urban derelict site or whatever. The same principles are in there. Great, and I've pretty much got to the wildlife corridors. Yes, absolutely understood. And yeah, lots of people making more exciting points. Good stuff. Okay, any last comments, Sally, on that, or indeed anything else just before I close? Didn't give you a chance.
Thank you. Just it's great to see so many people, and thanks for sticking with us. You didn't leave after 5 minutes, so it must have been an enjoyable evening. So thanks, everybody. I've certainly enjoyed it. I found it good fun, and there's been some really great comments, and I've made a few things that I'm going to go take away and find out more about. So thank you, and please do get in touch if anyone wants to talk about anything. Again, please do get in touch.
Thanks, Sally. So first of all, let me add my thanks. We've had in the region of 65 to 70 people in on this meeting, which is tremendous, and it's very difficult to handle. I apologize. All the faults there are mine. The discussion has been quite wide-ranging. There are some things we actually haven't managed to touch on, and I'm sorry about that. Particularly, we haven't managed to touch on the scale and concentration recommendations as much as I perhaps hoped, but we're here to respond to what interests you. The video, the chat, and everything else will be on our YouTube channel, so keep a lookout for that. It takes us a few days to get it processed. If one of the great things about a public meeting normally is that we then close the meeting, and then people come and talk to me and tell me the things that they didn't want to say in public, and we missed that, and I'm really sorry about that. So for that reason, Jess is or Sarah has just very kindly put up the email address and the phone number. So I am and after the last one of this happened, I am very happy to have a phone call with anyone if you wish, a private phone call. If you wish to do that, use the email address and we'll set it up and I'll give you a ring, because I'm more than happy to do that. Last comment before I close. Big thanks to Lorne, to Sally and to Shona. It's very difficult to think on your feet when all these things are coming up on a chat box. It's not the same as a public meeting in the village hall at all, but we've, I hope, responded insofar as we could. There are lots of things in there that are not for us, and would just reiterate, the Scottish Land Commission is a new and very small body. We've only got about a dozen staff. Many of the questions in there are for Scottish Government and for Forestry and Land Scotland and all the rest of it. Please ask them those questions. Don't just because we couldn't answer them doesn't mean to say they can't be answered. They jolly well can be answered. So please ask them. And lastly, thank you all very, very much for logging into something at this time of night and participating so actively. That's much appreciated. I won't say safe journey.